Have you ever heard someone say that your presence is only tolerated out of pity? Have you ever felt that, even when you give your all, what you receive in return is contempt disguised as companionship? I heard this from my own son, and it was as if every sacrifice I made for him had been erased in a single whisper behind the door. That night, I was in the kitchen, as usual, preparing dinner. I'd just paid their health insurance, my granddaughter's school fees, and even left the electricity bill on the table. But all of that seemed so small when I heard those words. The voice belonged to my daughter-in-law, but his complicit silence was what killed me inside. She's only here out of pity. They knew I was home. They knew I could hear. And yet they said it. As if I were an old piece of furniture, no longer in keeping with the decor, but no one has the courage to throw it away. Yet, in that moment, I felt invisible. Not the gentle invisibility of someone who grows older and is sidelined in household decisions. No. It was a cruel invisibility, where my presence was a nuisance, even though my money was welcome. That moment became a turning point in my life. It was as if the mask had fallen, and I finally saw what, deep down, had been there for a long time. I wasn't family, I was convenience. A financial solution, with legs. But what hurt most wasn't the sentence itself. It was remembering everything I'd done to get there. I raised my son alone, facing the world with what I had. I worked doing laundry, cooking for my neighbor, selling cakes on the street. I never let anything go unnoticed. When he got sick, I was the one who spent nights awake in the hospital, praying for God to let me take his place. And now, decades later, the same son who once slept in my lap said, albeit without words, that I was a burden. Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt like all your effort, all your dedication, simply means nothing to the one you love most? That no matter how much you give, sacrifice, or deny yourself, in the end, all you are boils down to what you can still offer in monetary terms? That night, I went to sleep with my heart crushed. I turned over and stared at the ceiling for hours, repeating the phrase, "She's only here out of pity." I repeated it until it hurt, until it burned, until the anger gave way to something colder. Because in that moment, something inside me shifted. And it wasn't sadness. It was something else. A kind of silence that comes when the pain hits rock bottom and has nowhere left to go. A kind of clarity. I wanted to say I cried. I wanted to say I screamed. But I didn't do either. I just remained silent. And it was in that silence that the answer came. An answer that even I didn't expect. Because when we get tired of being humiliated, our hearts begin to whisper what reason can no longer silence. And it was in that whisper that everything began to change. My name is Margaret, but most people call me Maggie. A simple, affectionate nickname, like the ones that used to exist when there was still time to care about words. I come from a time when everything was more direct, more honest. When we didn't say, "I love you" all the time, but proved that love in the little things. In a favorite dish served hot, in neatly ironed clothes, in a note left in the lunchbox. Life has never been easy for me, but it has always been full of meaning. I knew what I was fighting for. I knew who I was. Or at least I thought I did. I raised my son alone since he was 2 years old. His father, well, he left before he could say, "Daddy," clearly. And I never complained. I didn't have time for that. I worked hard, baked cakes to sell in the neighborhood, ironed clothes for my neighbor, cleaned stairs in an old building. It was exhausting, but it was mine. My effort, my routine, my silent struggle. The money was barely enough to make ends meet, but he always had what he needed. Food, clean clothes, new school supplies at the beginning of the year. And affection. Lots of affection. What I gave most was love. I remember watching him sleep, exhausted after playing, and thinking, it's worth it. Every sleepless night, every backache, every time I sacrificed myself so he could have something more. Because that was my role. It was what was expected of me. I didn't know any other way. I was taught that a real mother endures everything in silence. That a strong woman is the one who cares, the one who supports, the one who doesn't give up, even when no one is watching. Over time, he grew into a well-mannered, polite man, the kind everyone praised. "You raised him well," they'd say. And I'd smile, unaware that that pride would one day turn into a double-edged sword. When he got married, I didn't cry, at least not in front of others. I prepared everything with the greatest care. I helped with the wedding, contributed what I had, and handed my son over to another woman with a heavy heart, but full of hope. I thought I'd gained a daughter. I thought we'd form a bigger, stronger family. But not everything that seems like a union is a bond. Sometimes, it's a knot. After I became a widow, he invited me to live with them. "It'll be good for everyone," he said. And I believed him. I left my home, my things, my routine, everything behind, thinking I was going to a place of affection. I thought I'd be part of family dinners, decisions, conversations. But little by little, I realized my presence was tolerated, not welcomed. That the silence at the table was louder than any shout. And, deep down, something began to fade inside me. And the worst part is that, for a long time, I didn't want to see it. We get used to the little things that come disguised as familiarity. A question without hearing the answer. A murmured, "Good morning." A chair left behind on purpose. These are details. But it's behind the scenes of these details that the hidden truth lies. I found myself increasingly silent, walking lightly around the house as if I didn't want to disturb anyone. And every time I paid a bill, it was as if I were buying my way in. As if, unconsciously, I were trying to prove my worth through money. As if love and usefulness were the same thing. But the heart doesn't lie. The soul senses when it's out of place. And even as I tried to convince myself that it was normal, that it was just routine, that I was tired, there was something inside me that said, "This isn't how it's supposed to be." This seed of doubt grew over time. It began with small realizations, but soon became a constant weight, a kind of absence that was ever present. I became a supporting character in my own story, while life went on around me, as if I'd been trapped in a scene no one else was watching. I thought a lot about that Maggie from 30 years ago. The one who carried heavy bags without complaint, who made jokes to keep from crying, who dreamed of growing old surrounded by grandchildren and children. The one who, even with nothing, believed that love was enough. Where did that woman go? What happened to her dreams? How did she become this silent shadow sitting at the table unnoticed? These questions echoed within me like a pent-up scream. And with each day, I felt a stronger need to understand. To remember who I was before the silence. Because if there's one thing life teaches, sometimes too late, it's that forgetting yourself can feel like love. But, deep down, it's abandonment. And the worst kind of abandonment is the one we commit against our own soul. And it was in this void, in this memory that insisted on returning, that a new idea began to form. It wasn't yet clear, nor strong enough to turn into action. But it was like a spark. And sparks, well tended, have the power to turn into a fire. At first, I told myself it was just an illusion. That Karen's manner was just different, more direct, more practical. That Daniel was tired from work, and that's why he was quiet. That Emily, at 15, was just going through the phase where teenagers distance themselves from their elders. I repeated it like a mantra, like someone who needs to believe a lie to endure the routine. But the truth, that hidden truth we try to ignore, is that the signs were all there. Small, almost imperceptible, but constant. And they had a greater impact than I even cared to admit. It started with looks. Those looks that last no more than 2 seconds, but say everything. When I grabbed something from the fridge that wasn't mine, when I sat on the couch that apparently already had an owner, when I spoke and no one responded. Then came the subtle comments, disguised as concern. "Have you washed your hands, Grandma?" As if I were a naughty child. Or worse, as if I were a dirty burden. I smiled, pretended it wasn't my problem. I said I understood, that the house was theirs, that I just wanted to help. But each of those words accumulated inside me like dust on a forgotten piece of furniture. And it wasn't just what was said. It was what wasn't said. The lack of an invitation to an outing, The family lunch I only discovered when they returned. My granddaughter's laundry I washed and folded with care, but never noticed. The birthdays that passed as if I weren't there. All of this was like a script written behind the scenes of the house, a silent narrative that slowly erased me. As if my existence there was tolerated but never celebrated. Karen started leaving notes on the fridge with messages like, "Don't touch," or "Saved for dinner tonight." And I pretended I didn't care, even though I knew they were meant for me. Daniel started calling me Mom, only when he needed something, usually money. Otherwise it was she, Grandma, you, always in the most neutral tone possible, as if speaking of someone who lives downstairs. And Emily. Oh, Emily. She, who once slept with me cuddled up on the couch watching a movie, now barely looked me in the eye. When I spoke, she responded by fiddling with her phone. When I asked, she said, "I don't know." It was as if my voice had ceased to exist. These small acts of violence, these micro-rejections, were making me shrink inside myself. Not physically, because on the surface I still got up early, took care of the house, put lunch on the table, but emotionally, it was as if my presence were a constant error I constantly needed to correct. And no matter how much I told myself it was just a phase, that things would get better, there was something inside me that was beginning to change. A silent but steady transformation. Like a seed that germinates slowly, silently, but one day breaks through the concrete beneath. And that's when my mindset began to shift. I stopped seeing it as normal. I began to understand that what I felt wasn't exaggerated sensitivity, nor old lady drama. It was real pain. The pain of someone who dedicated their entire life to a family they now made a point of not seeing. And this brought me a harsh revelation. Perhaps I had taught people too much to be strong, to endure everything, to endure in silence. Perhaps I had sent the wrong message, that love was synonymous with self-denial. That those who truly love don't impose themselves, don't complain, don't take a stand. But true love should never humiliate. It should never diminish. Little by little, I began to see the decisions I'd made throughout my life differently. Not with regret, but with clarity. Every time I said, "Let it go," I left a piece of myself behind. Every time I gave in to keep the peace, I silenced my own existence. And when I realized this, the anger I'd felt from time to time transformed into something much more dangerous. Coldness. Not the coldness of someone who doesn't feel, but the coldness of someone who's felt so much they refuse to feel anymore. It was a kind of protection. An emotional shield that was slowly growing inside me, like an invisible wall between me and the world around me. Even so, I was still there. Making breakfast, tidying the living room, leaving the grocery money on the table. On the outside, I was the same. But inside, something was changing. And no one noticed. Not Daniel, not Karen, not Emily. They didn't see it because they were used to not looking. Used to Maggie who fixes everything, who doesn't complain, who's always there. But that Maggie wasn't the same anymore. It was an ordinary afternoon. One of those where everything seems to follow the silent script of a house feigning harmony. Emily was at school, Daniel at work, and I, as always, was taking care of the day. I'd spent the morning cleaning the bathroom and making an apple pie. My mother's old recipe, which only I knew how to make properly. I left it baking in the oven, set the table, and went to fold some clothes on the couch. Before I knew it, the sun was already beginning to set, staining the living room with that orange hue that made me long for times gone by. Everything seemed peaceful. At least until I crossed the hallway and heard something I'll never forget. Emily's notebook was open on the table. An essay, I think. I paused there for a second, curious, proud. I liked seeing how she wrote. She'd always had a talent for words. But I didn't even have time to read a line. Karen's voice, coming from the kitchen, pierced me like a blade. She's only here because she pays for everything. Poor thing, she doesn't even realize she's a burden. The tone was low, like someone whispering to hurt without admitting it. But it was loud enough for me to hear. Loud enough for it to pierce my soul. I felt a heat rise from my chest to my face, as if my blood had been replaced by shame. Shame for having believed I was still welcome. For having deceived myself for so long. My legs felt weak, as if the ground had turned to sand. My eyes stung, but I held on. I didn't cry. Not then. There, in that room lit by the end of the day, a hidden truth was revealed once and for all. Everything I pretended not to see gained a name, a voice, and an intention. That wasn't just a phrase. It was a sentence. A label stamped on my chest with no right to defend myself. And, worst of all, it wasn't spoken by a stranger. It was to someone I opened the doors to my heart, my home, my family. Have you ever experienced this kind of revelation? That moment when everything crumbles inside you, but on the outside, nothing changes. When your body remains still, but your mind screams. When disappointment isn't an explosion, but a slow, silent implosion. I stood there, motionless, with a notebook open before me and the echo of that sentence hammering away. I didn't make a sound. I didn't confront anyone. I simply kept quiet. And this silence, unlike all the others, didn't come from weakness. It came from something new, a kind of strength that was still being born. That night, I went to my room early. I refused dinner, saying I was tired. And I was. But not from cleaning or cooking. I was tired of pretending. Of smiling out of obligation. Of being useful to earn a place. Of loving without return. Of being called grandma only when money was needed, and of being treated like a polite nuisance at other times. I lay down without turning on the light. I wanted the darkness. The darkness doesn't judge. The darkness doesn't lie. I lay there, eyes open, watching each scene flash through my head like a movie projected on the ceiling. The parties where I'd stayed in the kitchen. The birthdays where my name was forgotten. The conversations where I was an invisible spectator. All of it now made sense, like pieces that fit together when you finally understand the bigger picture. But in that mental movie, something stood out. An early memory of Maggie in her early 30s, sitting on the living room floor, holding a small Daniel in her lap, the two of them laughing non-stop. I remembered exactly the smell of the house, the sound of the fan, the feeling of fulfillment. And I wondered, where had that woman gone? At what turn of the road had she lost her way? And what had happened to the child she raised with such love, to the point where today someone would call her a burden? The answers didn't come, but a certainty began to take shape. I could no longer continue to be just what was expected of me. Not everything that appears to be patience is a virtue. Sometimes, it's just exhaustion. And not all tolerance is wisdom. Sometimes, it's just fear of breaking with what seems stable, but is already rotten inside. That comment from Karen wasn't the beginning of my awakening. It was the final trigger. What came after that wasn't planned. It wasn't rational. But it was necessary. And irreversible. Because when the soul bleeds in silence for too long, it learns to scream in other ways. And there, alone in the dark, I understood that it was no longer a matter of pain. It was a matter of decision. And when a woman tired of being ignored decides to truly open her eyes, transformation is inevitable. The next day, I woke before the sun. Not because I'd slept well. Quite the opposite. The night was long, heavy, and restless. But something inside me needed to move. My head still throbbed from Karen's words, and my heart insisted on not forgetting. Even so, I got up. I washed my face with cold water, tied my hair back with the worn-out elastic that was always lost in the drawer, and went to the kitchen as if nothing had happened. It was easier to follow the script than to deal with the emptiness of improvising a reaction no one expected, least of all me. When I entered the room, the smell of coffee already filled the air. A strong, almost theatrical aroma. And there she was, Karen, cup in hand, stirring the sugar slowly, as if wanting the moment to last longer than necessary. Seeing me, she smiled. A warm, measured, almost automatic smile. "I made you coffee," she said. She placed the cup on the table as if offering something valuable, as if trying to neutralize what had already been said. And I silently accepted. Not because of the coffee, which, by the way, wasn't even that good. I accepted because I wanted to observe. Because in that moment, more than ever, I understood that something inside this house was being staged. She brought up trivial conversations. She commented on the weather, the soap opera, asked if I wanted anything from the grocery store. I responded with, maybe, I don't know. My voice was low, as if filtering what really mattered. I watched her eyes, her gestures. Nothing there was sincere. It was a careful performance. The false peace before the storm. And I knew. I felt it. That attempt at kindness, that gesture of sudden kindness, wasn't about me. It was about control. About keeping up appearances. About ensuring that the weight of the house remained useful and silent. Later, Daniel came home from work with a wide smile. He kissed me on the forehead, something he hadn't done in weeks. He thanked me for Emily's health insurance, saying it was a blessing to be there with them. And I just smiled. I said nothing. I just nodded slowly and went back to cleaning up. Inside, my mind was on fire. Because at that very moment, I realized that the greatest manipulation comes not from shouting, but from pleasing. That sometimes the enemy serves you coffee before nipping your freedom in the bud. And it's in these behind-the-scenes moments, in the small gestures, that the truth hides. Because the problem was never the coffee, nor the kiss. The problem was the silence hidden behind the forced kindness. It was the sweet tone used to erase the cruelty of the previous day. It was the desperate attempt to wipe away the scars with warm cloths, as if a poisonous phrase could be washed away with sugar. But the soul doesn't forget. It keeps. And when it understands the game, it starts playing too. In those days, everything seemed calm. They smiled more, asked more questions, included me in conversations. But there was a difference. Before, I felt ignored. Now, I felt monitored. Everything I did was noticed. My every step was accompanied by a sideways glance, a carefully spoken phrase. The house, previously cold, felt artificially heated, as if someone had lit the fireplace just to keep the visitor. And this perception, however subtle, completely changed the way I occupied that space. I stopped responding automatically. I started paying attention to the words they chose to speak to me. The pauses. The gestures. Every detail. I began to see the house for what it truly was. A minefield of fragile relationships, fueled by self-interest and disguised as affection. And the more I observed, the clearer the dynamics became. I wasn't loved there. I was convenient. And that was far crueler than being ignored. The journey that began with a whisper behind the door was now gaining deeper layers. I was no longer just wounded. I was awake. And this lucidity, even painful as it was, gave me a different strength. A clarity that came not from anger, but from awareness. From those inner revelations we can't explain, but feel there's no turning back. Because when peace seems too sweet, it's almost always because it comes with poison on the rim of the cup. And in that moment, between sips, I began to think about what was yet to come. It was supposed to be just a Sunday barbecue. The kind of casual gathering where the food on the fire disguises the atmosphere, and conversations spread through the backyard like smoke. Friends, co-workers, a few loud laughs, cold beer, and background music. I stayed in my corner, as usual. Discreetly helping in the kitchen, setting up plates, tending to glasses, making sure everything was in place without disturbing anyone. I already knew my position there. I wasn't invited, but I wasn't exactly part of the family either. I was that figure everyone knows but no one really includes. That silent presence that helps but doesn't belong. I stood by the sink, drying my hands on a dish towel when I heard the comment. It wasn't said in anger. It wasn't a direct attack. It was one of those jokes laced with venom. One of the guests, laughing, said, "That's the rich mother-in-law, right?" And soon after came Karen's response, quick, loud, without a second thought. "Not rich, useful. For as long as it lasts, right?" Everyone laughed. Easy laughter, light laughter, the laughter of someone who doesn't realize what they're burying in the other person. And I smiled too. Because there, in that moment, smiling was safer than confrontation, more acceptable than showing pain. Smiling became my shield. But inside I died a little more. It was like being slapped in public with a glove. Except there was no audience willing to be outraged. No one was surprised. No one defended me. No one even looked me in the eye afterward. As if the remark had been natural, acceptable. And maybe, to them, it was. Because when someone gets used to seeing you as a tool, any joke about your functionality seems harmless. But it wasn't. Those words touched a place so deep within me that I didn't even know it still hurt. I went back inside, washed a dish, organized the cutlery, and as I did so, my head spun. Useful. For as long as possible. I kept repeating this silently. It said much more than it seemed. It said that what kept me there wasn't love, wasn't respect, wasn't connection. It was functionality. I was a cog. A cog. A card that paid for health insurance, an occasional babysitter, an unpaid housekeeper. And when my usefulness ended, what would be left? This question hammered at me. And it made me realize something even crueler. Perhaps in their eyes, I was past my emotional usefulness. All that was left was my money. The rest was tolerance. And that was unbearable. Have you ever felt this kind of shame? The kind you can't tell anyone because it seems too small to warrant a tear, but big enough to ruin the rest of your day? Social shame doesn't scream. It whispers. It seeps into the corners of your soul and accumulates in the cracks. And when no one sees it, it weighs heavily. And it weighs so heavily that you start walking slower, talking less, breathing deeper before entering a room. Because every small gesture becomes shaky ground. Every sentence, a potential trigger. That night, after everyone left, I went to bed early. My body ached, but it was my spirit that was exhausted. I lay on my side, hugged my pillow, and tried to remember the last time I felt part of something. Not useful. Part. A loved, expected, desired presence. And I couldn't remember. Not with them. Not in that house. Not in the last few years. It was as if, without realizing it, I had accepted the role they'd given me. And now, trying to remember who I was before that seemed an almost impossible challenge. But deep down, even tired, even hurt, a spark remained. The shame, cruel as it was revealing something important to me. I still felt. And those who feel, live. And those who live, choose. And maybe, just maybe, that growing discomfort was an invitation. A push. A sign that the time was coming to look in the mirror with new eyes. To recognize that behind the silent grandmother was a woman. And that this woman, even though she was ignored, still carried within her a strength that no one in that house imagined. Because behind the pain lies power. And behind the humiliation, sometimes, there lies the beginning of a turning point that no one sees coming. And perhaps this was the greatest revelation of all. Realizing that, even when we think we're at the end of our rope, there's still something alive inside us. Something that pulses, that refuses to accept the role of an extra. I began to look at myself more carefully, with more presence. And, for the first time in a long time, I began to think about what I felt, not what they expected me to feel. That's why, if at any point in this story you felt anger, sadness, identification, or even revolt, I want to ask you something. Right here in the comments. Tell me what touched you, what bothered you, or what you've experienced but haven't had the courage to share. You have no idea how much this helps. Not just me, but other people who, like us, carry silent pain that never had the space to express. Your voice, your opinion, your story, it all matters. Every comment is like a collective hug that says, you're not alone. Every like shows that this content resonates, that it's worth continuing to share these truths that almost no one has the courage to say out loud. And when you subscribe to the channel, it's not just a click. It's a decision to continue this journey with us, to be part of a community that believes real stories have power. The power to transform mindsets, to provoke reflection, to heal what time alone cannot heal. So if something in this story has touched you, even if it was just a phrase, a memory, an old feeling, please leave a note here. Your presence here, even if virtual, has a real impact. And it's your presence that keeps this space alive. Because more than views, what we need is connection. Real connection. People who feel together, think together, and recognize themselves in each other's eyes. And it was precisely because of this silent recognition that, in the days following that barbecue, I began to think differently. To pay more attention to every detail. Because while everyone else was carrying on with their lives as normal, I was no longer the same. That night, after the laughter died down and the glasses were piled in the sink, I climbed the stairs slowly, feeling each step as a reminder of how much I had lost who I once was. I closed the bedroom door carefully, silently. Even if they wanted to hear, they wouldn't. The silence I carried wasn't that of one who accepts. It was that of one who observes. Of one who prepares. Of one who, little by little, begins to understand the value of their own limits. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor, thinking nothing for a few minutes. Until, out of nowhere, an old memory came flooding back with such force that I could almost hear my own voice in that younger, firmer, more alive version of myself. It was 40-year-old Margaret. The one who knew how to negotiate the market with a steady gaze. The one who raised a child alone and still found time to smile at the end of the day. The one who made no apologies for existing. The one who spoke clearly, who didn't accept emotional crumbs. Where was she? She was there, quiet, waiting for me to make room. Because what I realized that early morning, sitting in the darkness of my own room, was something simple yet devastating. I'd shut myself out for fear of losing their love. But what I received in return was anything but love. And then the question that would haunt me for the next few days hit me hard. What's more important? Being accepted with pain or being rejected with dignity? The hidden truth many women my age carry is that we learn from a young age to be the foundation. The base. The one that holds everything together. But no one teaches us that foundations also tire. That even a rock, when stepped on too much, begins to crack from within. And there, in that absolute silence, something in me began to change. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. It wasn't a desire for revenge. It was a desire for reunion. A reunion with myself. That night, I made a decision. I didn't verbalize it. I didn't write it down. I didn't cry. I just decided that no one would laugh at me anymore as if I were a decorative object with an expiration date. That I would no longer pay the emotional price of being useful to be tolerated. I decided it was time to take control of my own story again, even if that meant shaking up structures, defying expectations, breaking conventions. From that moment on, everything I did was viewed differently. The same breakfast I prepared was now made without urgency, without the rush to please. The same money I left on the table was now viewed as an investment, not a payment. I began to listen less and notice more. Every conversation that had previously passed me by was now analyzed with the coldness of someone studying a pattern. And the more I observed, the more I understood that behind the routine lay a broken emotional structure. I wasn't the problem. I had simply accepted being part of a dynamic that devalued me. And that, in itself, was reason enough to change everything. But you see, this change didn't come from outside. It wasn't an apology, nor a belated gesture of affection that woke me up. It was the discomfort. That discomfort that seems small at first, but grows until it takes over your chest. The discomfort of knowing you're where you're not celebrated. And that you're surviving when you could be living. And this discomfort, instead of paralyzing me, moved me. I began to plan. Not in a rush. Not in anger. Strategically. With self-love. I thought about the things I still had. Not just the material ones, but the emotional ones too. The history I carried, the contacts I maintained, the forgotten talents that once sustained me. I remembered the cake orders, the compliments at church parties, the neighbors who asked for my recipes. I began to gather these pieces of myself, like someone collecting rare pieces scattered around the house after a storm. Because that's what I was doing, collecting pieces of myself to rebuild a more whole, more complete version. And this reconstruction depended on no one, only me. In the days that followed, I remained the same in their eyes. But inside, I was a different woman. A woman who no longer expected affection from someone who had already shown what she was capable of. A woman who knew the impact of each choice, and who finally understood that all true transformation begins in silence. Because noise can distract. But it is in silence that truth emerges. And I knew that that truth, once revealed, would never go back to sleep. My plan didn't begin with a cry for freedom. It began with a whisper of courage. The kind of courage that comes after pain, after silence, after understanding that no one will rescue you if you don't move yourself. And that's how, alone, without fanfare, I began to move the pieces on my own board. My old house was still mine. A small 2-story house I'd bought with great effort years ago, now rented out. The rent money was always given to Daniel. We said it was to help with household expenses. But that house was my last route. My last physical reminder of who I was before I became that invisible woman. And it was with this in mind that I decided to sell it. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't ask for their opinion. I didn't wait for authorization. I just gathered the documents, talked to an old real estate agent friend, and in less than a month, the house was sold. With the money in hand, I sat alone in the bank, staring at the cold screen of the statement, and took a deep breath. For the first time in many years, that money was mine. Not as an inheritance, not as help, not as a sacrifice. It was mine by choice. And I knew exactly what I would do with it. I opened a coffee shop. Small, charming, smelling of warm pastries and freshly brewed coffee. I named it Rose's Cafe, after my mother, who taught me to make the best apple pie the neighborhood had ever tasted. I chose a spot near a school, betting that mothers and teachers would love a sweet break from the hustle and bustle of the day. And it worked. Within 2 months, the place became a landmark. It was more than a business. It was a refuge. A space where I wasn't just welcome, I was needed. And, most of all, I was seen. The transformation happened almost invisibly to those who lived with me. I'd leave early, saying I was going to go for a walk, or take care of some things. I'd return at the end of the day with bags, sometimes with the smell of flour on my coat, but no one seemed to care. They were so used to not noticing me that they didn't even realize I was gone. Not emotionally, not spiritually. I'd left that house weeks ago. My body remained, but my soul was busy rebuilding what had been slowly destroyed. And then one day, Daniel found out. Not because of me, but because someone mentioned it. A friend of Karen's walked past Rose's Cafe, saw the photo on the wall, saw my name on the business card, and thought it was curious. Too curious not to mention it at dinner. When he confronted me, I was washing a cup. Water was running from the faucet, and steam from the hot dishes rose as if to hide the tension building in the air. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. There was no anger in his voice. There was confusion. The kind of discomfort of realizing you no longer know the person you're living with. I dried my hands, looked at him with the calm of someone who no longer owes anyone anything, and said, "You see me as a burden. And a burden doesn't bring satisfaction." He didn't answer. He just looked at me as if he were seeing something for the first time. And maybe he was. Maybe, for the first time, he saw not the helpful mother, nor the silent lady of the house, but the woman. The one who had dreams, decisions, limits, and who, finally, was coming to terms with her own identity. This new version of me wasn't vengeful. It was fair. I didn't want to hurt, I just wanted to exist with dignity. Because the truth is that the money that had once cost me utility now gave me autonomy. And this is something many people fear, a woman who no longer depends. Because when you free yourself from the need to please, you begin to act truthfully. And truth, especially when it comes from an older woman, has an impact few are prepared to face. At Rose's Cafe, people call me by name. They ask my opinion. They compliment me. They listen to me. There, every detail was thought of by me, from the blue cup on the counter to the soft playlist playing in the background. It's my world in miniature. A universe created from the remnants of what I once was, now transformed into something new, alive, and powerful. And the more the cafe thrived, the more I thrived inside. Because it wasn't just about selling cake or serving coffee. It was about finding purpose again. About transforming every wound into strength. About proving without shouting that the journey of rebuilding can begin even after everyone has given up on you. And in that new routine, between coffees and conversations, a revelation began to take hold within me. A revelation that didn't yet have a name, but which I knew was about to change the course of everything. It wasn't long before life began rearranging the pieces with that silent precision that only time can achieve. Things changed quickly, not because of me, nor because of some hidden agenda, but because there's a kind of balance the universe insists on maintaining. When you sow disrespect, you don't reap gratitude. And when you treat love as currency, it simply ceases to exist. And it was in this quiet movement of life that their turning point arrived. Karen lost her job suddenly. The company made layoffs, and she was on the list. No personal reason, they said. But the truth is, she'd been unstable for some time. Too many harsh comments, low energy, constant dissatisfaction. It was a reflection of what she'd cultivated. Daniel, meanwhile, fell ill. A back problem that kept him out of work. First for days, then weeks. And with the bills piling up, the weight of reality fell like a brick on both of their laps. For the first week, they didn't say anything to me. They continued acting as if everything was normal. But all you had to do was look closely and you could see the cracks. The fridge was emptier, the moods were shorter, the eyes were more averted. And I watched. Not with pleasure, nor with superiority. I watched with the serenity of someone who has already understood that some of life's answers don't need to be spoken by our own lips. Life responds in its own time. And there, it was just beginning to show that no one ignores their own actions forever. It was then, one random late afternoon, that they called me in to talk. They were sitting on the living room couch like two children waiting for the lecture they knew they deserved. Daniel was direct. He said the situation was difficult, that they were going through a difficult time, and that if I could help, it would be temporary. The word temporary trembled from his mouth. And for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I took a deep breath. I sat up slowly. And with the same calm I used to reorganize my life, I looked my son in the eye and replied, "I'll help, yes. But with a contract. Love is free. Disrespect is not." The silence afterward was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. Karen looked away. Daniel lowered his head. They knew what those words meant. They knew the time when I'd automatically say, yes, was over. That the mother who'd withheld herself for fear of rejection had given way to a woman who knew her own worth. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. About setting boundaries. About showing, firmly and respectfully, that love doesn't survive where there's contempt. And that true help only happens when there's reciprocity. Because helping someone isn't about carrying that person on your back until the end of your days. It's about extending a hand when they show they're willing to move forward. That they've also learned. That they've also changed. But that day, I saw no change. I saw despair. And despair, when not accompanied by sincere repentance, only reveals how much one still believes the other is an obligation. That the other is an emotional bank. That they will always be there, regardless of how you are treated. And it was at that exact moment that a new realization dawned on me. I had spent my life trying to teach with gestures. But perhaps now it was time to teach with boundaries. To show that love also says, no. That respect is also learned through consequences. That true transformation begins when comfort ends. The days that followed were different. They began to walk slower, to observe me more carefully. Their words became more measured, their conversations more full of subtext. It was as if they were realizing, for the first time, that I wasn't unbreakable, that there was a limit, and that they had crossed that line long ago without realizing it. Deep down, I knew there was still a long way to go. That life's justice isn't limited to a moment of weakness in someone else. But that episode, that simple conversation on the couch, was a turning point. An emotional turning point that not only reshaped our relationship but also cemented within me something I'd been cultivating for months. Awareness. The knowledge that everything I'd endured, every silent humiliation, every unrequited gesture, had prepared me for that moment. And that now, I was no longer a victim trying to be seen. I was a whole, determined woman, clear about what I deserved and what I would never accept again. And it was precisely in this new perspective that something unexpected happened. A small gesture, almost insignificant at first glance, but one that would reveal more than words could explain. Life has a subtle way, sometimes cruel, sometimes surprisingly delicate, of giving back what we give. It took me a while to understand this. I spent years believing that those who love must endure everything, keep silent, give everything. But it was in the silence, in the time when no one asked me how I was, that I began to listen to myself. And it was this silence that taught me more than any word ever spoken in that house. Looking back today, I realized that my greatest revolution wasn't opening a coffee shop, selling my old house, or saying no to my own son for the first time. My true turning point was emotional. It was within me. It was stopping begging for affection and starting to cultivate respect. It was stopping expecting recognition from those who never saw my efforts, and instead, recognizing the woman I've always been, even when no one else did. Rose's Cafe has become more than a business. It has become a symbol. Every customer who sits there and calls me Mrs. Rose, unaware that the name comes from my mother. Every cup served with care. Every compliment to the cake made with my childhood recipe. All of this is a reminder that the roots we plant, even in the darkest times of life, can always blossom again. And sometimes they blossom in new soil, with their own light, far from the shadows that tried to extinguish us. Daniel and Karen changed. Not suddenly, not like in a movie, but gradually. His illness and her dismissal opened up gaps. And in these gaps, the possibility of reflection entered. I don't know if it was true regret, or just the shock of realizing that the invisible woman had a name, a history, and now, power. But I know they began to move differently. They began to measure the tone of their words, to listen more attentively, to seek, albeit timidly, a reconnection. But the biggest revelation came from Emily. A simple gesture, almost imperceptible, but one that shattered me inside. She showed up at Rose's Cafe the other day, alone, unannounced. She sat at the corner table and ordered the apple cake. When I brought it to her, she smiled a little and said, "That's still the best smell in the world." I smiled back, trying to hide my emotion. She sat there for almost an hour. She didn't say much. She just stayed, looking around, taking in every detail. And before she left a folded note next to the cup. A simple piece of paper, torn from her school notebook. It said, "Sorry I didn't see you before. Now I see you. And I admire you." I kept that note in the cash drawer, among the receipts and loyalty cards. It's the smallest piece of paper in that drawer, but the most valuable. Because in that moment, I understood that the impact of our decisions goes far beyond what we can control. That even when it seems no one is paying attention, someone is always learning from how we get back up after being knocked down. The transformation that happened to me wasn't a miracle. It was a construction. One brick at a time. And each of those bricks was shaped by small but consistent choices. Choosing silence when screaming wouldn't make a difference. Choosing action when waiting meant remaining trapped. Choosing to respect myself when no one else would. And, most importantly, choosing not to harden. Because the world already has too many people wearing armor. I chose to heal, not to turn to stone. Today, I live in a small apartment, but it's all my own. I care for my things with the same care I once did for that house. I have a group of friends with whom I have coffee every Saturday, and we talk about everything. From old recipes to the pain we've carried since the world started pretending that women over 60 no longer have stories to tell. But we do. And one of the most valuable. Because life doesn't end when others tell us it is. It begins again when we decide to stop asking permission to be who we are. And that was, perhaps, the most important lesson I learned after all this. I am not a burden. I never was. I am the foundation. The column. The foundation. And more than that, I am a whole woman, even with all the scars that life made sure to leave clearly visible. Because it was these marks that told me, and now tell anyone who will listen, that, yes, it is possible to turn the page. Even when the story seemed to have been written by other people's hands. And there's still more I need to tell you. One last memory that came back recently, and that made me realize something that had gone unnoticed until then. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this story resonated with you. Maybe it was a memory, a familiar feeling, or simply a desire to see someone find their strength after so much silence. Whatever it was, thank you for accompanying me to the end of this journey. If this message spoke to you in any way, write in the comments, "I see you, Maggie." I want to know who's stuck with me this far. Because it's this silent exchange, this invisible thread connecting us, that keeps this space alive, sincere, and necessary. Subscribe to the channel if you want to continue hearing stories that aren't just mine, but that contain pieces of many women like me, like you, like so many others who have gone through life giving more than they received. And if at any point you felt this video was worth your time, leave a like. This helps YouTube show this content to more people who also need to hear this truth calmly and without shouting. And since you're here, there's a video on the side that complements all this in a way you might not expect. Click and stay with me there. We still have a lot to talk about.